Just a note that this podcast may touch on difficult themes and include some challenging conversations, so please take care when listening. This is The Widow Diaries, a podcast that holds space for the often unspoken stories of grief, love and life after loss as a young widow. I'm Caroline Winter, and like so many, I've been on this journey. So come with me each episode and hear from others who've also walked the winding path of widowhood in their own way. The Widow Diaries, for First Light Widowed support, where no story is the same and every story matters.
I kept a journal for the first year after Richard's death. There was a place for me to talk to him, as well as write all the things that were inside me that I couldn't quite say out loud. And yes, there was a lot of swearing. But that motion of putting pen to paper with no expectations of what might come out was so freeing, and it helped me express my grief in all its layers. When I read my words now, more than a decade on, the rawness of it all jumps out of the pages and reminds me how that heavy blanket of grief slowly lifted, and also how far I've come in rebuilding a joyful life. Words have such power, whether they're yours, mine or someone else's, and for Megan Daley, author, teacher, librarian and podcaster, writing and reading is what helped her work through her grief and that of her children when she was widowed. After losing her brother, her aunt and then her husband, Megan's life was turned upside down. And in this chat, we talk about raising kids while navigating loss, blending a new family while still honouring the past, and how books and stories can be powerful tools for healing. Megan, thank you so much for being with us.
It's so lovely to be here. It really is.
Now, Megan, it is not lost on me that as we record this today, it's 8 years since your late husband, Dan, passed away. Wow, anniversaries and milestones,
Yeah.
huh? How are you feeling?
Yeah. Look, it's interesting when we made this date, and I'm busy, so there was a bit of backwards and forwardsing, but when we made this date, I didn't initially put the two together, and then when I saw and remembered what date it was and that it was Dan's anniversary, I thought, well, that's just a bit perfect, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a bit perfect, and it's something that anyone listening, you, myself, days and time have a whole new meaning once you lose a person, don't they?
They really, really do. Yeah, it can be so very fast and seem like it was yesterday. I just thought this morning that it's been 8 years since Dan passed away, and it feels like it was 3 minutes ago sometimes, and other times it feels like it was a lifetime ago.
Yeah, absolutely true. And can I ask, do you do something to mark the day at all?
It's really dependent on what my children want to do. So this morning, for example, we did actually go out for breakfast before we went to school, and we intended to visit the cemetery where my late husband is buried, but in fact the girls just said, no, we just want to go to a coffee shop because Daddy really liked coffee. So we went to a coffee shop and we got some pastries, and it was just really lovely. So we usually do something, but I really make it quite dependent on what the girls want to do. But the remarkable thing that happened this morning was that I was woken at 5 a.m. to this absolute cacophony of kookaburras just caroling, and Dan's favourite birds were kookaburras, and he often made kookaburra noises for the girls when he was calling them instead of whistling. And I just thought, well, if that's not a moment to reflect and think about Dan, what is?
Those are the moments that, it's like a wink and a nod, isn't it?
It is. It's beautiful. That's exactly what it is.
Well, I feel like we're talking about Dan and he's not here, but he is very much here. This is an important day, but an important conversation. For those of us who might not know your story, can you just tell us a bit about Dan, how he came into your life, and I guess how he left?
So Dan and I met when we were quite young. We were about 18 and we were both working at McDonald's. He was at one McDonald's in the city. I was in another McDonald's, and we just hit it off. And we were together from the time we were very, very young, and we got married when we were quite young, and we just did so much together. We had such a full life, for which I am now very grateful. We went to a lot of music festivals. We went to a lot of literature festivals. I'm a librarian, so I love reading. Dan was a massive reader as well. So we partied hard and we loved hard, and we had a fabulous, fabulous 20s really and 30s. And in that time we got married, we had our two beautiful daughters, and life was pretty good. Dan did live with chronic back pain, and that was at times incredibly crippling. So he lived with a debilitating illness, and pain was etched on his face a lot of the time. But he was a quiet individual. He was softly spoken. He was considered in everything he said. He was gentle. He was loving. And he was incredibly witty. And the pain, he managed life as best he could. He passed away reasonably soon after my aunt died. I had a brother pass away suddenly a couple of years before Dan died, and then my aunt died a few weeks before Dan died, and we were away as a family putting our lives back together when Dan suffered a fatal heart attack. So for me and for my children, I was surrounded by love and by support in my family. And whilst none of us will ever forget, the incredible sadness and horror of Dan's death, we did it together. We were there all together. And from the moment Dan died, I was supported by my family and by a village of people who love and adore me and my children, and who love and adore Dan to this day.
And that stuff is everything at that time, isn't it? That support from wherever it comes from, but particularly when you have two young children also.
Yeah. Yes, the incredible intensity of solo parenting hit me like a sledgehammer. So my village has been incredibly important in my life.
So let's just talk a bit about that. Going from a family to a solo parent, grieving as you were, not just for Dan, but for your aunt, for your brother still, even though it was a few years after.
Yeah.
How did you navigate that as a parent and as a human?
I've spoken to many widows in the years since Dan has died, and a lot of us that have children often say it's our children that kept us going and gave us that reason. But then, and my children know this, so I don't mind them hearing this, but then it is also, I often say it's really hard to grieve with children. There's not a lot of space for your own grief. And my focus had to very, very much be on my children and their grief. And I also found the grief of Dan's friends and his family. There was obviously a lot of grief around the death of this beautiful, beautiful person. And at times it felt like it was all crashing in on me. And I sometimes, and literally, and again, my girls won't mind hearing this, they slept on top of me. And at times I felt like my two children were wanting to crawl back inside me. Their grief was that intense. And I found it incredibly overwhelming. And I've often heard grief described as like a dark, heavy blanket over you. And I felt like I had this blanket around me, which was my children and everybody else's grief. And it was hard at times to find that space for myself to grieve. And I think that process has been a very long one.
Yeah. So where did you go looking? What did you do in terms of being able to deal with your own grief, to have those moments to yourself?
Gosh, it's just really hard. I did what you probably shouldn't do and what the textbooks will tell you not to do. I buried myself in work. I am a teacher librarian, but I'm also an author. And just before Dan had died, I had signed a contract for my first book. I wrote that first book in the 6 months after Dan died. It's 75,000 words. And I don't remember writing a lot of those words. The second edition of that book is coming out later in 2025. And I was saying to my editor recently, when I read back my book now, which has done really well, I don't recognise a lot of the writing because I I just threw myself into pouring out. My book is about a love of reading in children, but there's grief interwoven throughout it. And I think I just poured myself into that book. I'm very proud of that book. And I think that's my first year of grief, is that book. Look, I was very well supported by family and friends as well. My dad slept over every Tuesday night for a very long time, and that gave me space. Often we didn't talk, often I would just write, but it gave me space, and I found that writing took my head into another space. And even though a lot of my writing was about Dan, it just took me into this space of that was all my own.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because writing or journaling is a really important way to work through anything. They often say that can be your time aside. So effectively that writing might well have been the therapy that you needed.
I think it probably was, and I've read a lot about journaling through grief since that time, and at the time I probably wouldn't have said that's what I was doing. And I did a presentation for First Light with a dear friend of mine and fellow widow Emma Gray, and we talked about writing your grief and reading your grief, and that when I was putting together that part of the presentation, I thought, yeah, that's what I did. I really journaled through my grief, but I wrote for a very public audience. I also at the time had a blog, and I wrote very publicly on that blog about my grief, and those posts all still exist, and they've actually become a really important part of me looking back at the story of my grief and owning it and almost celebrating my grief, because I don't think in Western culture we talk about grief publicly enough, and I felt instantly not comfortable sharing my story at all, but I wanted to share my story because through sharing stories, we all learn and we all grow as people, and my blog was a really important part of journaling my grief as well.
Well, and I've certainly read some of those posts, and I can see the comments that people have left. So you were not just helping yourself, you're certainly helping others.
Yeah, I hope so. I think blogs are a really interesting way to connect with other people, and social media in general, I found an excellent way to connect with people. In the middle of the night when you can't sleep, there's always someone online you can chat to, and those friendships can be really deep, or it can just be an opportunity to read the stories of others and feel comforted and seen and heard.
Absolutely, actually, and I remember 2013 was when I lost my husband, in the dead of night when I was looking for someone to talk to. Unfortunately, First Light wasn't around then, but Soaring Spirits in the US was, and there's nothing quite like connecting, despite it being a club no one wants to join, but connecting and just knowing you're not going through this alone.
That's right. And I think that's what widows now, like you and I, have had the opportunity to do, isn't it? Like I had exactly the same experience as you. I would be able to connect with someone at whatever time, and that's such a bonus, I guess, for want of a better word, for it to be in a terrible club.
Absolutely. How did you talk to your daughters about grief and loss in a way that they could understand at the time?
Well, I'm a children's librarian, so
very helpful.
Yes, and I had already gone through the grief of my brother, and I did have a little chuckle. A few years after my brother died, my nieces said to me that they didn't really want any more books with a dead dad in them. And I thought, look, that's a fair point. I was just trying to find something you could connect with. But anyway, but I did use books a lot as a means to talk to my children and to their friends about their grief, about my grief, and about language surrounding grief, because when you are newly widowed, at times you are completely and utterly lost for words, and books give you the words when you have none. And they also sometimes they articulate what you want to say but maybe can't say. Authors, particularly in this space of writing about grief and loss, are really, I mean, they're magic, and they're artists in the way they put together words. And I remember reading a book called Life is Like the Wind by psychologist Shona Innes. And I remember reading that book. It's an early childhood book, and just thinking that's everything I've ever wanted to say to my children about grief, that life is like the wind. It comes and it goes. And, you know, it's just the most beautiful book to explain grief to a young audience. And I used books a lot.
That's a great tip for anyone who's going through this and has young children, because I was going to ask were there particular books or stories that you turned to with your girls during that time. And there's one right there.
Yeah, there was many, many, many. And I've got, again, on my blog, I've got on my website really more these days, I've got lots of lists of books about grief for different ages. And as my girls have gotten older, one of them's now in year 12, and I still seek out, not necessarily purposefully, but I still note those books in my head that are for teenagers that have got grief as a theme. And there's lots of beautiful books for all different ages, and I keep a list on my website and just on my computer for my own benefit. And when I speak at events or death cafes, you know, I just think books are such a magical way to assist us through this process of death, dying and loss.
Just talking about grief, and you obviously had a fair bit of compounding grief with the number of people that you lost in a period of time there. Do you feel, I hate to think that you're an expert, no one wants to be an expert on grief ever, but do you feel that you've come out the other side with a much, you know, deeper understanding of what it is and how to sort of counsel yourself and others through it?
I definitely feel like I've got a much more balanced view of death, dying and loss these days. Once upon a time, it terrified me. And now I realise, and it's interesting you asked that question. A child asked me in a prep lesson today, they talked about a plant dying in our school rainforest and how sad that was. And I said, yes, but everything that is living has to die one day. And that's something that I say quite a lot now, even to young children, because I now know that if we are blessed to live a great life, we are also going to die one day. And I'm much more comfortable is not quite the right word, but I understand that that I can't hold on to things too tightly in life, and I just have to live the best life that I can, as do my children. So I don't know that I'm an expert, and I had a recent occasion to talk to a newly widowed person, and they asked me quite a lot of really technical advice, and I just said, look, that's more for a psychologist, but I definitely know the ins and outs of the early days of sorting out a funeral and the people that you need to turn to and what you do with all of the lasagnas you receive.
Oh my gosh, so
all
many
of that
lasagnas.
kind of practical stuff. Yeah. I call them grief lasagnas these days. I actually really like lasagna, and apologies to anyone who made me a lasagna. I made my way through them. But I do now, whenever I eat lasagna, I say, oh, look, it's a grief lasagna.
You are not alone. I had no idea until, yes.
Yeah.
You went through the worst possible thing that anyone could imagine in losing your person, but you have certainly built another life, a different life. Tell me about meeting Murray and who Murray is and blending your family.
Yeah, that's I guess the second part of my story, isn't it? And First Light's been really interesting for me in that way as well. I was really, really adamant, and I said to my children right from the get-go that I would never repartner and that they would just have me. And my beautiful teaching partner at the time, Jackie Child, said to me in front of the girls, Mummy shouldn't say that. Mummy, you know, and she said to me, Megan, you may one day repartner and you are meant to be with a person. And I really appreciated her saying that, not at the time, but now. And I, in fact, did some years later, or a few years later, I have a bit of an obsession with bees. I did agriculture at school, and I'm not quite sure how I ended up a librarian, because I was always going to go into sort of the nature field. But I've always loved bees from a very young age, and I was at a friend's event, and there happened to be beekeepers there, and I was really excited to meet a real beekeeper, and I was fangirling over this table of beekeepers or bee industry people. Oh, look, I'm a total bee nerd. I've written a book about bees for children, and I wrote it way before I met my now beekeeper. I have always loved bees, but I met my partner at an event. He's a beekeeper. His name's Murray Arcadiff. He is also widowed. He has 2 small boys. I had 2 small girls at the time. We are incredibly Brady Bunch. The girls are blonde-haired and the boys have dark hair. We are so Brady Bunch. We just really need Alice.
I can only imagine what your household is like. Let's talk about that in a moment. But in those early days, what were, I guess, some of the tender, the tricky or even surprising moments in the process of you becoming a family?
It was really hard for us to tell other people that we had met someone else. It was really hard for us right at the very start. It was very hard for both of us to even consider the idea that we might repartner. It felt like a betrayal of our husband and wife, but you know, we now joke about it. They definitely were involved in us meeting because we're basically like male and female versions of each other, and we out-talk each other all the time. But at the time, it felt like there was a lot of wrangling within ourselves about how we felt about maybe having feelings for somebody else and the impact that would have on our children. I think when you're widowed and solo parenting, your primary concern is always for your children, and both of us were very, very nervous about how that would all work. Also, being widowed, you're not divorced. You don't get week on, week off. We have both had our children 7 days a week, and it was tough. So we met each other's children extremely quickly, and our relationship was really forged in as a unit of 6. We've everything that we do as a couple and as a family, you know, it's been right from the start. It's been together, and that's been a blessing. At times it's really exhausting, and we're both very honest when we talk about this and say, you know, we feel like we're still learning about each other quite a few years on, because we haven't had those long times to sit down and talk about things, and we didn't forge our relationship and build our relationship before our children were involved, as you might normally do. The children had very strong opinions on Murray and on myself. So right from the start, they would tell us what was right and wrong very clearly.
It sounds like your children are, you know, like to be heard, much like their parents. So that's a good thing.
It is. And you do want that for your kids, don't you? You do want them to feel heard in a scenario. We're not living in the ages where children are seen and not heard, although sometimes I wish they were. And I do have a tendency to put on my noise cancelling headphones in the evenings. And if those headphones are on me, it signals she needs some space, and I will never get AirPods because I want the big headphones so everyone can visually see I need some space and quiet.
I do love that. Now, you've touched on something really interesting, because many widows repartner with someone who hasn't been widowed, and that, of course, comes with its own complexities. But that's very different when you're both widowed. So in terms of the grief and the experience that you've been through, you know, you might lean on someone who hasn't been widowed to kind of carry that with you. But how do you go when you're both carrying your own grief and trying to support the other person?
Well, again, today being Dan's anniversary, Murray was really cognizant of the fact that I know he's been watching me in the last few days. We say this about each other after the anniversary. Oh, you've been on the increase in temperature and temperament. And you know, and then I don't know for you, but for me, I often find that day after the anniversary, this kind of like, this letting go again. And we're quite aware of when the other person is grieving. We also talk about it a lot. We will both say we're feeling really griefy at times. And I think for us, Helen and Dan are very much a part of our family. So we're getting married later this year, and the wedding will be about us, but it will also be, we will also touch on the love that we had for Helen and Dan. Both of us for a long time still felt married. At times I still feel married, and it's a strange conundrum and situation to be in. I'm actually keeping my late husband's surname, and a few friends have been like, oh, okay. And I'm like, I'm really cool with that. And so is Murray. I think for us, it's worked well, both being widowed, but I do know that it can be a really tricky thing to navigate. But I think if you can both give each other space to still love the person, and, it's like when you have a second child, love is endless. Love has an endless capacity. I love Dan and I love Murray, and how fortunate am I to have had two, enormously wonderful experiences of relationships.
Yeah, so very beautifully said. I think the surname equation is an interesting one, and I actually had written this down as a question to ask. Because you're a public speaker and an author. So you go by Daley because you always have, and getting married, would that change or otherwise? I actually kept Winter as my surname professionally, but I did take my now husband's surname in all the other walks of life, which is just a painful process in itself.
Exactly.
But it was because I always wanted to carry Richard with me in that way. So keeping
Yes.
Daley, does that mean that you kind of carry Dan with you forever?
Absolutely. And I'm all about making my life as admin free as possible.
Oh, yes.
And for me, exactly what you said, I just thought, also Murray's last name is Arkadeef, which is quite difficult to spell. We do call ourselves the Daley Ark family, and we call ourselves that on everything. So we kind of call ourselves the Daley Arks, and I'm just going to keep Daley and he's going to keep Arkadeef. And, but I think we had a few conversations about it. It was probably me that wrestled with it more, but we both will carry Helen and Dan with us always. And in fact, I'm using elements of my wedding ring from my marriage with Dan in my wedding band for my marriage to Murray. So I just feel like Helen and Dan are very much with us through our children, but they're just with us. They were a part of our lives, and neither of us need to shut that story down, I don't think.
I'd like to just focus on the kids for a moment and bringing them all together, which, as you say, is the Brady Bunch. How did you develop the relationship that you now have with the boys, and in the reverse, Murray with your girls?
Murray will listen to this, and so I don't tend to tell him this. I probably should tell him this more often, and other people say this. Murray is a natural parent. He is a natural lover of family and of chaos and of the beauty of a blended family. He was a natural with my girls. They were older, and they both at times went through periods where that was not something that they wanted. Of course, they didn't want a stepdad. They didn't know what that meant, and they also were having a fine old dandy time with me, doing everything for them. And the richness he has brought to their life is, you could not possibly quantify it. But he said right from the start, I'm never going to be your dad. You had a wonderful dad, but I'm always going to love you like a dad. And I think that for me was the moment I thought, yep, he's a good one, and he gets this, and we can do this. And it wasn't easy at times, and we had a lot of toing and froing with my girls. I think particularly because they were older and I had a lot more vivid memories of their dad. But he was really gentle about it, and he always gave them space to yell and cry and be angry at him, but know that he would never walk away. And that was a remarkable thing to witness, and he's taught me so much about the endless capacity of love. For me, the boys were a lot younger, and I did a lot of, but they were also very cautious of me, naturally cautious, as you hope your children will be. And I spent a lot of time reading books to them at bedtime, and particularly with the youngest one, he didn't want me anywhere near the bed or on the bed, so I would sit next to his bed and I would ask him if that was okay, and I would get closer and closer as the weeks went on. And my girls really helped me connect with the boys, because right from the start, our children I mean, I make it sound like a fairy tale. There's lots of biting and scratching and blood, but as there is amongst siblings. But on the whole, our children adore each other, and they've asked not to be called step siblings on school records and so forth. So my girls were instrumental in us forging a relationship with the boys, again, because they were a lot younger and it needed to be really playful and fun. And so we did a lot of going to parks, and very quickly in our relationship, the pandemic happened, and Marie is a commercial beekeeper, and my introduction to parenting small boys was when he had to go to Victoria to pollinate almonds from Queensland, and I was left with the boys in the pandemic. And that time was amazing in a sense, because the boys had to rely on me. I had to rely on them just doing their thing, and my girls doing their thing, and we kind of all like rumbled together really well. And I actually think the pandemic was a great thing for our relationship as a family, so it worked really well for us. But yeah, definitely the relationships have taken a long time to forge, but gosh, I look at us now and I think, how far have we come and how well have we done?
Oh, it's a remarkable story. The kids were young, as you say, when you got together. How old are they all now, and what's their relationship like now? Because I guess we're moving into teenage years, no?
The horror. We have a 17-year-old completing her final year of schooling. We have a 13-year-old. We have an 11-year-old, and we have a 9-year-old. And you know, again, if you looked at us from the outside, you wouldn't necessarily know we're a blended family, because the children's ages are staged quite well. It was really helpful, very much so actually. But they really are just, it's like they've never not been a part of each other's lives. And that's really what us getting married was about. I was maybe less, I was like, oh, do we need to get married? But I think we've made the decision that we want to get married, because that's a symbol to our children that this is it. This is forever. This is your family. These are your siblings forever. And they, like I said, there is still fighting and blood and biting, but there is a lot of love. And the boys have taught my girls so much about boys and about energy and about play, and the girls have taught the boys so much about being gentle and soft and chaotic. Yeah, chaotic as well. They've probably all taught each other how to be chaotic. They just, the whole situation is very chaotic.
You and Murray are just there along for the ride. It's the kids who are, you know.
It's a roller coaster ride.
You mentioned, you know, how much they've taught each other. I'm curious around how much all of the kids have taught you and Murray about resilience and love through this experience.
That's a really interesting question. I really like that question. Off the top of my head, the thing that springs to mind straight away is my kids have taught me that, you know, you can love freely and trust a good human. You know, our kids had to trust that we were making a good decision about good humans that we were repartnering with. And they've also taught me about the resilience of children. And I mean, we see this, of course, in terrible world events like wars and terrible historical events where children have this ability to just go on and be become a good human in the world. And it is an absolute privilege to watch our children becoming good humans in the world. And I think it's made them, not that I wish grief upon any child, but it's made them have a depth and a richness to them. And I really can feel they're going to be remarkable adults.
I would say that is to do with a great lot of parenting there, not least what you've been through. Megan, what has rebuilding, I guess, a joyful life taught you about grief? And we started this conversation talking about grief in sort of that depths of despair type of grief. But it's not just that. It's such a complex word and a complex situation to be in, isn't it?
It is. I know now that grief, and it's such a cliche, but it's a journey. It's an up and down. It's an always. I know that I said at the start that grief to me felt like this really heavy blanket and physical blanket of my girls just over the top of me. But these days my grief feels light, and I have an incredible peace around the deaths of Dan and my brother Simon and my aunt Susie. I can look at their deaths and their lives, and I can celebrate their life, and I can be just so pleased I knew them and loved them and they were a part of my life. But these days my grief is it's just more free flowing, and it comes at me at times, and at other times it's far away. It's always there, but it's not a heavy cloak anymore. Grief these days is much lighter.
Just as we kind of wrap up, I want to take us back to your role as a teacher librarian, because I think it's a really important one. The name of the podcast is The Widow Diaries, so seems extremely appropriate to be talking to an author, especially with everything that we've spoken about. As someone deeply connected to children's books, do you think, and the answer is probably yes straight away, that literature offers a special kind of healing during grief? And it certainly sounds like you found your way there accidentally, I suppose, in some ways.
Yeah, very much. I mean, a lot of widows would say in that first year after their person dies that they can't read a book, and I was certainly very much the same. But I tell you what, audiobooks were my saving grace. I would go on walks. My wonderful neighbours Renee and Trent would look after the children, and I would go on walks, and I would put on, I listened to a heck of a lot of grief. I used to call it my grief lit list on Spotify and on Audible. I would listen just over and over to books about grief, fiction and non-fiction. And again, those words gave me the words I needed to articulate what I was feeling at times. So books definitely helped me through my journey. I know they help children through their journey. And as a teacher librarian, I have books on the open shelves about death, dying and loss, because for children of all ages, because death is a part of life and we need to have those conversations with our children. And I think literature is a beautiful gateway into some really tricky conversations for young people, teenagers particularly. Like I know I've often just put, not even a book about grief, but a book that I've particularly wanted one of my teenage daughters to read now about a particular topic, and I'll just pop it on their bedside table, and no words need to be said, but it might be about, world events or issues just in teens' lives, and it just gives them that time and space as well. So I think books for children and adults who are grieving are incredibly important, and if you don't feel that you're up to reading a book, audiobooks are the bomb.
Yeah, great advice. Now, as a teacher librarian, an author, a speaker, a widow and a raiser of a rabble of children, what role...
rabble of children, all right.
What do you see for schools and teachers in supporting grieving children? Because your children obviously were young going through this, but also you would have seen that firsthand in, just being in the school system.
I haven't had a great experience, and I know widows listening, widows who have children will probably have had some positive and some negative experiences. On the whole, I don't think in Western culture we deal with grief at all well, and I think that schools are really complex communities who are trying really hard, but unless you've got a leader at the top or a leader in that counselling team somewhere, if there even is one, then who understands grief and loss, it can be a really tricky space. I didn't have a great experience of schools dealing with the grief of our husband and wife, dealing with the grief of Murray's boys at the school that they were at and the school my girls were at. I had some wonderful experiences with one-on-one staff, but as whole organisations, I think that schools don't deal with grief very well at all. And there's a range of reasons for that. They have to cater to an enormous amount of different families who've got different feelings around what should be discussed in a school situation. But I had some terrible things said to me about my girls, like, we won't announce certain things because we don't want to cause hysteria around death. And I had people say they didn't want my children to talk about the death of their daddy in the classroom or at school. And if we could just not use the word dead, if we could just say passed, which I often find a bit of an unusual word. The person hasn't passed, they've died. I didn't lose my person, they died. So I've had some I've had some stand-up arguments with people in the schooling system, not at schools that I've worked at, but I've had some stand-up arguments around language about death and dying and loss in the education system. And I've done some work with a couple of different organisations who are looking at that really closely, and about how death literacy, like financial literacy, should be a part of something that we do as the education system. But I think there's a long way to go before schools are able to manage death in a way that, and it will never work for every person, because of course every family situation is individual. But yeah, my own experience hasn't been great. And I say that as somebody who works in the education system, and I'm very sorry about that.
I was going to say, and schools are a very small microcosm of wider society, and as we've spoken about, and we know that death is not spoken about or handled well. If there was sort of one, I guess, piece of simple advice you could give to a teacher who might be faced with a child in their class losing a parent dying, what would you say to them? What could help?
Well, first I would say to the whole staff of teachers, change your language around how we talk about mums and dads. The amount of times my own girls were sitting in class and I'll go and ask mummy and daddy how to do, or show this to your mummy and daddy. And as a teacher librarian now, when kids borrow books every week, I say, take these books home to your grown-ups, read them with a grown-up you love. I just use the word grown-ups in relation to parents. It's 2025. We've got so many family situations. To be using mum and dad as your go-to to talk about grown-ups is not okay. So that's my first thing to a whole staff. And then to that teacher, I would just say, acknowledge the child's loss. It's really important for your child to know that you understand that they've lost someone very dear to them, and that, you may not be the person that feels they can talk to that child about their death of their parent, but just letting that child know that you see them and you can really, you can see their pain just goes an incredibly long way. And allow children to express their loss in ways that might feel uncomfortable for you. You don't have to share pictures or drawings that they've done about the person that has died with the whole class. But, I had situations where my girls have been asked, whether we've been told not to write about death in essays or whatever, because, and teachers have said, because we haven't experienced death. And my children have experienced death. If they want to write about death, I want them to write about death. And so I just think having open conversations as classes, as schools, as systems is really important. But just acknowledge that child's loss if you've got a child who's lost a parent in your class.
That's great advice. Megan, I like to round out each interview with 3 questions. My first one to you is, what do you like to do to remember your person outside of, outside of today, which is of course the 8 years? My beautiful youngest brother made a wonderful Spotify playlist for Dan's funeral, and it was added to by all of my late husband's friends and family. His sisters are great muso, and she tells me that, I grew up on a steady diet of Van Morrison. She was more contemporary, and yes, anyway, she does have very, very good taste in music, and lots of people added to this Spotify playlist. So when I'm thinking about Dan, and often in the car when I'm alone, I put on that playlist, and I'll usually go to an Australian hip hop and blast it really loud, because he loved the lyricism and the beat of Australian hip hop. So I put it on loud, and sometimes scream out those words in the car by myself. Nice one. Well, I hope that you'll be listening to that on the way home tonight.
I will be.
What's something helpful that you would say or have said to someone who's newly widowed?
Yeah, I actually, again, it's such a timely question. I had a parent at school was widowed just last week, and I haven't spoken to that parent in person, but I just sent a message through some contacts to just say that, this is really tough, and there is nothing that is going to make this situation okay for them at the moment, but to just take every moment as it comes and to always try and find the light and the laughter in every situation. I remember, there was even laughter planning Dan's funeral, and if you can always look for the light and the laughter, that goes a long way in those early days of grief. But I think sometimes a person just needs to hear, it's really terrible, isn't it? And You're allowed to feel everything and anything, and you don't have to make excuses for the way you feel.
I like it. And just finally, what, if there is, a quote resonates with you most at this point in your journey?
My favourite quote about grief is from a book called Grief is the Thing with Feathers by Max Porter, which I think I've listened to like well over 10 times on Audible, and I own several beautiful editions of the book. And my dear friends Thomas and Daniel gave me this book, and the quote is, "Moving on as a concept is for stupid people, because any sensible person knows grief is a long-term project. I refuse to rush. The pain that is thrust upon us, let no man slow or speed or fix." I just think that's perfect.
Oh, wow. And what a perfect place to finish. It's been an absolute delight. Thank you so much, Megan, for taking the time and for such a warm and real conversation. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely no problem. It's stories that need to be shared.
Thank you to all my guests for sharing their stories so generously. The Widow Diaries is hosted and produced by me, Caroline Winter from Pod Talk, for First Light Widowed Support, which provides information, resources and connection for young widowed people throughout Australia. Follow or subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode. And you can also find out more information at firstlight.org.au. This podcast acknowledges and celebrates the traditional custodians of the land and waters on which stories have been told for thousands of years and on which this podcast is recorded.